So my theme is going to be about forgiveness, but first I need to establish some context into which I will introduce this theme. So the social context I'm standing in as I speak is Serbia. So I have never been to Serbia or the old Yugoslavia, so I speak in a sense from a position of ignorance. But in the forefront of my mind is Serbia's reputation as it is in the United Kingdom, which has to do with the atrocities that took place in Bosnia during the last 30-40 years in Serbia's name. Notice, I didn't say that the atrocities were committed by Serbia, but committed in Serbia's name. The distinction is important. You, on the other hand, might have other social contexts in the front of your mind. It might have to do with your relationship to Croatia, or the refugee crisis, or maybe some division in your group analytic institute, maybe with Serbia's developing economic relationship with China, and so on. But I stay with mine. And straight away I have to correct myself, because to speak of Serbia and Bosnia in this lumpen way is crude. To speak in this way is to perpetuate a version of racism in which they are all the same as each other and as bad as each other, and we are all as good as each other. As Elias says, the self-image of the us is modelled on the minority of the best and inclined towards idealization, and the image allocated to them is modelled on the minority of the worst and is inclined towards denigration. To this way of thinking, depending on where one stands, from one perspective it looks like all Serbians are sinners and all Bosnians are saints, and from another perspective it looks the reverse. But in trying to escape the danger of lumping all Serbians in the same box and all Bosnians in another box, we might fall into the opposite danger of erasing all power differentials between the groupings under the banner of moral equivalence, in which everyone is equally to blame. It is for these sorts of reasons that my feelings on being invited to contribute to this conference are complex and similar to the feelings I had when I was last invited to speak in Israel. On the one hand, there was the prospect of genuine mutual warmth, friendship, and rich exchange with colleagues. On the other hand, I was filled with doubt regarding the meaning of my taking up an invitation to go to Israel. In going, was I in some way tacitly condoning Israel's treatment of the Palestinians? If I did not go, then was I taking a superior moral judgmental position in relation to my Israeli colleagues, holding them to blame for the treatment of the Palestinians? So even as I start to think about writing this talk, I found myself immediately caught in the predicament of this conference: reflective citizens, paralyzed citizens. I notice that even as I begin to reflect, I find myself paralyzed by anxiety and uncertainty. And what right do I have anyway to condone, condemn, or comment on how people live lives in countries far away from my comfortable home in the west of England? What do I know of the realities of day-to-day life in Serbia, Israel, or even India? For that matter, what do I know of the day-to-day reality of the homeless man living on the streets of my picturesque rural town in Devon? So, these are some of the tensions I find myself caught in even as I begin. So rather than speak about you and your situation, which would be an impertinence, I will start by speaking about me and say something about my social context. So my first question to myself is this: what has the ordinary citizen to do with the actions taken by the political leaders of the countries they live in? In my case, mostly, I feel that the decisions of the state have very little to do with me. Whether I find myself agreeing with them, which is very rarely, or strongly disagreeing with them, which is mostly, I feel alienated from the decision-making process. But mostly, I am ignorant and apathetic in regards to what is taking place in the larger political social sphere, because I'm preoccupied by the everyday demands of my little life at a local level. I could equally have phrased the question differently and asked, what sense of responsibility do I have for actions taken by my country, by my people? This I find more difficult to answer because I don't really have a sense of identification with either of the candidates for the role of my country, Britain and India, by which I mean that I don't have patriotic and nationalistic feelings. And when I meet those that declare a love for their country, I feel nervous around them. And the same is true of those who announce themselves as believers and followers of some faith, or as members of some racialized ethnicity. And when I meet those who embody a combination of all three, I feel very nervous indeed. It is the case that I was born in India, and so I am Indian. I have lived in the UK since I was 12 and I hold a British passport, so I am British. I find a sense of home and belonging in both contexts, and even whilst I'm not fully identified with either of them. But I cannot escape so easily. Despite myself, I feel immediately implicated when I read in the newspaper that the Indian government is currently persecuting the internet pressure group Avaz, Greenpeace and other movements that are criticizing the policies and actions of the state. Greenpeace, for example, is challenging the government's decision to allow multinationals to mine for coal in regions that will result in the destruction of the habitats of people as well as forests. Indian citizens who work for Greenpeace are being branded anti-nationals. They're being prevented from travelling, they're arrested on flimsy charges, their bank accounts are frozen, and so on. When I hear this, I feel disappointed as well as ashamed. But why do I feel shame, given that I have no say in any of these decision-making processes in India? Somehow, despite living on a different continent for most of my life, I feel, what's the word, responsible? Somehow, I feel associated with these actions. In some sense, it is my people that are doing this. But surely, they're not my people. The values of the political party currently in power are right-wing, neoliberalist, nationalistic, and ethnocentric. The current Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, a self-proclaimed Hindu nationalist, currently has a case against him in the courts of the state of Gujarat for having played a key role in allowing and fostering the murder of 1,000 Muslims during rioting there in 2002. Senior, respectable police officers who have testified against him are being targeted by false allegations in order to intimidate, discredit, and silence them. And given that most people think that Modi did have a hand in the slaughter, how are we to understand the fact that, knowing this, the Indian electorate nevertheless saw fit to elect him as Prime Minister? In electing Modi, is the electorate condoning the murder of the 1,000 and so making themselves complicit in the carnage in some way, or are they indifferent to the loss of the 1,000? So despite the BJP and me both being Indian, they are not by any means my people. Even so, I nevertheless feel implicated and ashamed by association. I feel ashamed because at some level I have an attachment to India, and in this sense it is indeed my country. But even if I were a voting citizen of India, what would I be doing? In all likelihood, very little that is different from what I am doing now, making disapproving noises. And even if I had an inclination to do something, would I have the courage? I am not sure I would, particularly when I see that the state is vindictively crushing those who try to make a public stand against corruption and malpractice. Or to put it another way, what would it take for me to step out of my comfortable life and join others in public protest? But it is not just in India that these sorts of things are taking place. In the UK right now, the central government is in favour of multinationals drilling for gas and oil deposits under our towns and nature reserves, fracking as it's called. Local government is resisting this because it is known that fracking is bad for the ecosystem and toxic to those who live in the vicinity. So central government has passed a law that forces local authorities into making their decisions quickly in 16 weeks. If they don't comply, they are said to have broken the law and they are punished. So although I have a sense of outrage at the blatancy of the anti-democratic activities of governments in both countries, I do nothing apart from voicing outrage and disbelief as I read the newspapers, the daily grumble. But at least I feel safe enough to make disapproving sounds. In many contexts, even to do this is to put one's life and livelihood at risk. Is the UK such a context? Well, in some ways, no, because I'm able to say publicly and in print that I loathe the Prime Minister Cameron and the Conservative Party for the way that they are destroying the National Health Service, the cavalier way they are treating the environment, for the cynical way they are allowing the elites to escape paying taxes, for the way they persecute the vulnerable, and so on. But in other ways, yes, I do live in such a context, and here are some examples from recent times. In 2014, the Conservative government in the UK came to pass laws that were called the gagging laws, which in effect have made it impossible for charities and non-government organisations to mount effective criticism of government policy. To do so would result in criminal proceedings and accrue severe penalties. Another example. In 2012, 3 years ago, senior police officer John Buttress in the Manchester Police Force tried to expose bullying and other malpractices. Since then, over the last 3 years, he has been investigated and criminalised by his police force's counter-corruption unit for a whole series of alleged improprieties, for insider dealing in shares and irregularities with his mortgage and so on. It went to court. The courts found him innocent. It was also discovered that crucial evidence exonerating him was withheld from the courts. But despite being found innocent in public courts, an internal police inquiry found him guilty of misconduct and sacked him. Just last month, a very powerful and successful charity called Kids Company had its funding pulled by the government following the charity criticising the UK child protection scheme as not fit for purpose. It has been suggested that the government was offended by the fact that the charity they were supporting dared to criticise its policies publicly. So it is not just in the so-called third world that ruling elites shamelessly use their power status to manipulate the legislature and organisational procedures to bolster their position and destroy those who try to expose questionable policies. Increasingly in the UK, even at a local organisational level, rules and regulations are being designed to control communication and silence dissenting voices. More and more formal codes of conduct, both for statutory and for not-for-profit organisations in Britain, decree that it's a disloyal and a disciplinary offence for an employee to say anything in public against the organisation. And when a few brave individuals do speak, they are destroyed. Worryingly, this silencing ethos is also beginning to creep into the codes of conduct of psychotherapy institutions. For example, the Institute Group Analysis in London in its Codes of Conduct, one statement is, members must not do anything to bring the profession of group analysis into disrepute. And from the group analytic GASWA, the one in Bristol, they say, a member of GASWA shall not speak unfairly, professionally or personally, of a colleague or group of colleagues to a patient or to potential patients, either privately or in public, or to members of the public in general. So, before the Enlightenment, it used to be the case that it was the monarch or priest who told you what you were allowed to think. The Enlightenment was a call to arms. The philosopher Kant decreed that it was each individual's ethical duty to think for themselves and not let themselves meekly comply with the pronouncements of the more powerful. The Enlightenment was key to the creation of modernity. But now, ironically, the modern condition is in process of being rolled back by these very freedoms. Is in the process of rolling back these very freedoms. Even whilst we were freed from obligations of royal pronouncements and holy texts, we have become enmeshed by the laws of the state. The bureaucrat has come to replace the priest and prince to become our master. The bureaucrat is both creator and representative of the authority vested in law. In this way, all our efforts come to be directed at finding ways of complying with the law rather than fulfilling our Kantian obligation, which is to be reflective citizens, to dare to think things out for ourselves. The bureaucrat has turned the rationalism advocated by the Enlightenment into a dogma, and it proselytizes it with the ruthless fervor of the zealot. This is a crude, harsh, persecutory rationalism that does not just distort the spirit of the Enlightenment, it destroys it. Reason is being championed by mindlessness in the same insane way that the Inquisition championed the Christian values of love with hate, fear, and death. In contemporary life, the definition of good and bad, right or wrong, becomes one of compliance, whether or not one is complying with the regulations of the state, with the procedures of the organization. If you dare not to comply because you sincerely think differently, they will come down on you with a vengeance. This then is something of my socio-political context, in which I've tried to describe the ways and reasons in which I feel alienated and disenfranchised when it comes to larger political issues. I've also said something about the fears and anxieties that tend to make me a paralyzed citizen rather than a reflective citizen. So I will now introduce the theme of forgiveness into this context. So, very often, forgiveness is alluded to in ways that are banal and reduced to shallow platitudes like forgive and forget. But forgiveness is a work. It is a deep psychological and ethical work. And being a work, it is not as easily accomplished as these sorts of glib phrases might suggest. Moreover, to this way of thinking, the persons required to do the forgiving, are the very ones who have had harm done to them. And the persons they are required to forgive are the very ones who have harmed them. This double burden does not seem very fair. You suffer an injury, and then you have to forgive the ones who have deliberately and maliciously caused you this injury. This sort of understanding of forgiveness is individualistic and internalist. The full burden of the work of forgiveness falls on the victim, who has to look within themselves to find there some way of conjuring up an attitude of forgiveness. But if one's understanding of human life is relational, interpersonal, and intersubjective, then this would suggest that others in the interactional field will also have some role and contribution to make to the activity of forgiveness. So even here, at this very early stage of the exploration, there is the shadowy hint that the work and activity of forgiveness is not located within the victim, but is some property of the network, a very Fuchsian notion. Now, in order to try and make my discussion of forgiveness less abstract, I will tell you a little more about myself. Although in no way could my childhood be described as traumatic, neglectful, or abusive, nevertheless, for many years I harbored deeply resentful feelings towards both my parents for the slights, hurts, and injuries I experienced from them during my childhood. Of course, this was not all that I received from them, but this was what was foremost in my mind, in that state of mind. Then one day, I must have been in my 40s, in the midst of some conversation, my mother made some allusion to the fact that she had been quite punitive towards me when I was a child. Her tone was remorseful. In that moment, my resentments towards her suddenly and surprisingly melted away. In saying whatever she said, my mother was not saying sorry, nor was she asking me for forgiveness. I am quite confident that she was not aware of the significance for me of what she was saying. And yet, it brought about a powerful shift in me, a shift as it was unexpected and sudden. So if she was not saying sorry, and if she was not looking for forgiveness, then what was occurring? I think her regretful tone served as some form of tacit acknowledgement, some form of recognition. This acknowledgement acted as a balm and dissolved my resentments, leaving something in me that was akin to forgiveness. I say akin to forgiveness because I'm not sure it was forgiveness per se. It was more a sense of something dropping away, of a tension easing. What becomes clear through this little story is that although the feeling of something akin to forgiveness was evoked and located in me, the victim, as it were, the work of allowing the possibility of forgiveness arising in me was done by the perpetrator, my mother. More important than the words, which I cannot really remember, was the tone, the effects of which I can still recall in my body. So, if the state of forgiveness is some state of grace, then I was the undeserving recipient of this gift. Undeserving because I myself made no efforts to get there. It just happened to me. Now the situation in regards to my father is somewhat different. He seems unable and unwilling to engage in any such process. He's one of those people who cannot even imagine that he might do wrong, let alone admit to any wrongdoing, even whilst he uses his patriarchal power and authority to vindictively bully, intimidate, and humiliate those who are weaker than him. He experiences himself as the injured party, as the hard done by, misunderstood one. In this situation, there is no easy solution for me. I remain to some degree stuck with my sense of having been wronged, stuck with my grievances, resentments, and hatreds. Stuck. With no gesture forthcoming from him, it would seem that it would be up to me to find a way to move on and free myself from the coils of hurt and resentment. I am now confronted by my inadequacies. It seems that without some form of recognition or acknowledgement, some gesture from him, I find I'm unable to move on. I'm unable to generate in myself a sense of forgiveness. Perhaps it is only saints who have this capacity to forgive in such circumstances when there is nothing forthcoming from the perpetrator. Perhaps this capacity is beyond what mere mortals like me are capable of. Jesus had this capacity to forgive even while suffering the horror being inflicted on him by his torturers who showed no regret. Extraordinarily, in this moment, Jesus said, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." I have no such saintly capacity in me, and I venture nor do most mortals. I seem incapable of forgiving without some recognition that I've been hurt and wronged. It seems that in order to move on, I need the help of others. I cannot do it by myself. If the one who has been done to is incapable, the victim, and if the one who has done is incapable, the perpetrator, then the only hope left is with the third party, the bystander. In my little story, the bystanders are my siblings, other family members and friends. Now, the attitude of some bystanders might be a baffled bewilderment, saying that they were not aware of what was going on. They cannot understand my reaction because they did not notice the action. Their attitude can be one of impatience with me, that I should just get over it, and I should just stop bleating. I should stop being oversensitive. That was then, this is now. I should just move on. In the face of such a negating response, I feel despondent, profoundly alone, and it evokes in me a kind of despair that is something close to what we might call depression. In contrast, when a bystander recognizes and confirms my reality in some way or other, this feels like relief, as it eases something within me. In part, this happens because I no longer feel so alone. I feel relief because my experiential reality, which has been minimized and denied by others, is finally affirmed. It is recognized. And in this moment, the bystander is no longer a bystander, but transformed into a witness. Curiously, despite nothing having changed in my father's account of things, the effect of the witness does shift something in me in relation to my intransigent father. Curiously, in some subtle way, it also shifts my relationship to the world at large, and I find I am more able to get on with my life. I think that much of the effect of psychotherapy must arise in exactly this way, with therapy serving as witness to unacknowledged experience. This is a very different ethos from the one that thinks of psychotherapy as treating and curing a psychological disorder. Therapy as witness is the moral work of healing. Therapy as treatment is the technical work of curing. More and more, I'm inclined to think of therapy as healing rather than treatment. Now, in the rest of this paper, I will stay mainly with the bystander, because in the main, that is what we all, that means you and I, are. So assume that the reality is as described by the victim rather than the denials of the perpetrator. And I want to ask, in what sorts of circumstances is the bystander likely to side with the denials and revisionist histories of the perpetrator, and why? The denials of the perpetrator are easier to understand than that of the bystander. The perpetrator's denial is in the service of self-preservation. No crime, therefore no punishment necessary. But why does the bystander take the stance of an alleged neutrality which actually sides with the oppressor? Out of the many possible reasons, here are two. One is self-serving, and the other is to do with an intense form of identification that won't allow for discrimination or differentiation. Fear and paralysis are integral to both. So the self-serving motivation. The first of these allows one to feel innocent even whilst one is benefiting from the actions of perpetrators. So, for example, institutional racism, sexism, and so on work in exactly this kind of way. The way that organizations come to function, their rules and procedures are such that certain groupings find it easier to progress and other groupings never quite make the grade. The individuals who prosper by the way the system is structured are innocent in the sense that they themselves are not, they don't do anything bad against another person. It is just that they encounter fewer structural obstacles to their progress up the hierarchy. But there are harsher situations in which people are deliberately excluded. The law can be written in ways that explicitly exclude some groupings from participating in professions or owning properties. In one context, these might be Jews, in another Muslims, in another women. So, if the cake is divided between fewer people, then each is bound to get more. In this sort of situation, it is in my interest not to notice the reasons why it is easier for me, but not for you. And if I do notice, then all that I might notice is that none of this is my fault, it is the system that is at fault. The situation here is not one of paralysis, but deliberate, convenient blindness, a blindness that is underpinned by guilt. Guilt because I saw, I gained, I did nothing. I'll move to the second form of motivation, over-identification. When a grouping feels beleaguered and under attack for whatever reason, the result often is that the internal differentiations within the group disappear, and as they all come together to face a common enemy. In this sort of situation, where one's very existence is precarious, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to expose the differing attitudes within the group to the outside world, because to do so is to give ammunition to the enemy. Personal survival becomes intimately linked to group survival. In such circumstances, the situation is highly polarized. If you are not with us, then you are against us. You will know this for yourselves, of course. Lacanians, Jungians, Kleinians and Freudians make common cause when faced with the attacks of the behaviorists and cognitivists. They put aside their differences for the greater good, the life of psychoanalysis itself. In this sense, loyalty is fickle, as it shifts from Freudian and attaches itself to the greater cause, psychoanalysis. The same dynamic can be found in racism, sexism, and other marginalizing processes. For example, in the situation where black people are subject to racialized processes, in situations where they are targeted, vilified, and marginalized, the differences between them, between the values of Seventh-day Adventists, bankers, criminals, teachers, football fanatics, these differences matter little. The critical category that they all subsumed under is black. And because this is the category through which they are all maltreated, it becomes the category that they all end up defending and protecting. Peculiarly, in this sort of situation, in one which is sort of forced into claiming a category not of one's natural choosing, there develops an attachment nevertheless to that category. For example, the religion I was born into was Zoroastrianism. Whilst this is meaningful to me culturally, I am an atheist and faith does not play a conscious role in how I live my day-to-day life. However, if it turned out that the country I lived in decided to target Zoroastrians, then my relationship to that category would go through a fundamental change from it being at the margins of my sense of self to it becoming my primary and entire identity. This sort of dynamic and experience was the case for many Jews in Germany. For example, Norbert Elias tells us that in the early part of the 20th century, his family thought of themselves first as Germans, then as Jews. This has also been the case for many Muslims in Bosnia, some of whom identified first as Yugoslavian, then Bosnian, then Muslim. Anyhow, the point I want to make is that in this sort of situation, in which one feels pressed into a grouping and oppressed by virtue of belonging to that grouping, then it becomes difficult to speak against others in that grouping. In this sort of embattled situation, to point the finger at one of your own is betrayal. This dynamic is not only true of the persecuted, but for different reasons it is also true of the persecutors. When faced with the disapproval of the international community for what some of the persecutor grouping have done, all those within the grouping end up feeling vilified and persecuted. In this context, the possibility of naming the wrongdoing becomes more difficult for two reasons. First, because to point the finger at the wrongdoer amongst us is to point a finger at one of your own, which is taken to be betrayal. Second, as a consequence of the accusation and vilification levelled at all of us, guilt for the wrongdoing of some of us comes to be attached to all of us. So, although this kind of blind solidarity looks the same in both the persecuting and persecutor grouping, I think that there is a crucial difference between them. For the persecuted grouping, blind solidarity is a matter of survival, of life. They have to hold together to try not to be annihilated. Meanwhile, the blind solidarity of the persecuted grouping is not in the service of life, but death, their own death, the death of their humanity. I'll explain that as I go on. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've been using the term grouping rather than group. And I'm doing this in order to hold open a space for the possibility that not everyone in the persecuting grouping acted as persecutors, and not everyone in the persecuted grouping is innocent. Not every Israeli is a fundamentalist Zionist believing the comforting myth that contemporary Israel was created without cost by a people without land finding a land without people. Not every Jew asserts that there has never existed a Palestinian people, thus enacting yet another final solution. So, returning to the question of the blind solidarity of the persecutors, many of those in the persecuting group, although personally innocent, might nevertheless find themselves silenced by blind solidarity. This is even the case for those who were not bystanders, but took part in protest against the wrongdoings that took place in their name. In the UK, many protested against starting wars in the Middle East, parading with banners that said, "Not in my name." Here in Serbia, hundreds of thousands took to the streets in Belgrade night after night in protest against Milosevic. But the protesters too can find themselves gripped by blind solidarity, because the outside world lumps the protesters in with those they have been protesting against. This forces them in the direction of over-identifying with the grouping they are positioned in. Thus it might come to feel even to them that to name one of us as wrongdoing is to accuse oneself through association. The intricacies of this dynamic are unclear to me. Somewhere in there must be some mix of guilt and shame that serves to paralyze. What little hope there is in this sort of situation lies with the bystander, particularly bystanders within the persecuting grouping, because they have the possibility of bearing witness to the carnage, and in that process not only salvage their own sense of human dignity from the mix of shame and guilt, but also potentially free others to do the same. In this way, some process of forgiveness might be precipitated. But is forgiveness called for in all situations? Jesus said, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." But the horrors of genocides everywhere are horrors all the more precisely because they do know exactly what they are doing, deliberately inflicting pain and humiliation, raping, callously tormenting, and murdering innocents without mercy. Are such deeds forgivable? Indeed, would it be ethical to forgive situations not only where they did know, but they took malicious pleasure in as they inflicted these horrors on fellow human beings? It does not seem right to forgive monsters for their monstrous deeds when they show no hint of remorse. Imagine that a paedophile violated and killed your child. What would be your state of mind following such a horror? Would forgiveness be reasonable in such circumstance, even if the paedophile were remorseful? To engage in any form of common or normal contact or exchange with such a person, to sit at a table and talk, would surely be a deep betrayal of that lost child. What I'm more likely to feel is the opposite of forgiveness, the wish for revenge. What lies between the two, between forgiveness and vengeance? In this sort of situation, can one ever reach any sense of reconciliation with what has occurred? And this might eventually be able to manage, a kind of resigned accommodation to the horror. I cannot imagine myself ever getting over it in any sense. This is my limit as a mortal. To be mortal is to accept the finitude of existence, to accept my finitude, not only to know that there is a limit to my life, but also to know that there are limits to what I am capable of. I come to think that in this mortal realm, not only is the propensity to forgive limited, it should be limited. I have a sense that in this mortal realm, to forgive the unforgivable would in itself be a sin. I start to get a glimpse of the spiritual depths and magnitude of generosity required for forgiveness. The capacity to forgive the unforgivable is perhaps only possible for saints, because unlike finite mortals, they exist in the realm of the infinite. Forgiveness has nothing to do with rational calculation. Forgiveness has little to do with compensation for injuries caused. Compensations are just that, compensations, a way of making do. In the mortal realm, wrongs can never be righted. The dead can never be brought back to life. The hurts and griefs can never be reversed or undone. Humpty Dumpty can never be put back together again. What can the idea of justice mean in such circumstances? The closest we might come to an experience of justice is through punishment, which is a form of inflicting pain on the perpetrator. In this sense, punishment is always vengeance. In some circumstances, I know that I would have a sense of deep satisfaction knowing that the perpetrator is being made to suffer in some way. But this sort of satisfaction, this vengeance, is also nothing but a form of compensation, as it does not and cannot right the wrong. In the mortal realm, this is perhaps all I can have. So the critical significance of acts of acknowledgement and recognition become clearer and clearer, as do the limitations of what these gestures might achieve. Acknowledgement and recognition help heal the wound. Without this, the wound continues to fester. If no acknowledgement is coming from the perpetrator, then the burden, the duty, falls on the bystander. And to some degree we, and I include myself in this we are all bystanders who fear to speak and transform ourselves from bystander to witness. I'll say something about remorse now, briefly. Remorse is integral to the act of recognition. Without remorse, recognition is empty of meaning. In order to inflict horrors on another human being, one has to dehumanize them. But in order to torture another, the torturer has also to cut off from their own humanity, and so they dehumanize themselves. If this is so, then perhaps Jesus is right when he says of the torturers that they do not know what they do, because in order to do what they do, they have to become something other than themselves. According to the philosopher Raymond Gaita, remorse is the feeling that arises in one in the moment that we are shocked awake by the bewildered realization that it is persons, humans, that we have been injuring. Remorse is a process of rehumanization. The perpetrator's remorse transforms the perpetrator's perception of the victim from thing to human. But the perpetrator's remorse also does something more. It transforms the victim's perception of the perpetrator from monster to human. Because in showing remorse, the perpetrator reveals something of their humanity to themselves as well as the victim. And in so doing, they rehumanize themselves in the eyes of both. Remorse is an expression of deep empathy. Now, human to human, some form of reconciliation is more possible. Well, individuals express remorse, but countries and organizations also try to express remorse. And they do this in one of two ways. One way is to make formal apologies for past actions in historical time. For example, just last week, whilst in Canada, the Pope acknowledged on behalf of the Catholic Church, the Pope apologized on behalf of the Catholic Church for, quote, the spiritual, cultural, emotional, physical and sexual abuse, unquote, suffered by the indigenous people of Canada at the hands of church leaders. So he made this apology. But during the same visit, the Pope intended to make the 18th century missionary Sarah into a saint. On hearing about this intention, there was protest and outrage in the indigenous groupings, who said, quote, Sarah played a pivotal role in the enslavement, torture and other violent tactics perpetrated against native peoples through the mission system. The fact that the Pope went ahead and canonized Sarah anyway shows that this kind of apology is mostly hollow and tokenistic. It was also the case that for most of the 20th century, it was the official policy of the Australian government to use state agencies and church missions to forcefully remove children from Aboriginal families and place them in non-Indigenous settings. In 2008, the Australian Prime Minister made a formal public apology, which was experienced as heartfelt and moved many to tears. Some 10 years earlier, the Prime Minister of the day, John Howard, had refused to make the same apology on the grounds, quote, that a formal apology could be construed as an admission of deliberate wrongdoing. This bizarre way of thinking seems to suggest that it might be possible to make an apology that does not admit to any wrongdoing. Well, that's one way countries try and express remorse, is through making these public apologies. The second way that countries and institutions make these gestures of remorse is by erecting monuments to shame. But mostly, countries do the opposite of erecting monuments to shame. They erect monuments that celebrate their triumphs and erect memorials to their own hurts and injuries. Monuments of triumph say, look how powerful or clever or important we are. Meanwhile, memorials of hurt and injuries say, look, never forget, this is the hurt that has been done to us. The site where the Twin Towers once stood being an example of the latter. Britain, like most countries, is more prone to erecting monuments of the second kind, monuments to its triumphs and memorials to its injuries. For example, last year, to mark the centenary of the First World War, 2 artists created a very powerful memorial. They placed 900,000, almost 1 million, ceramic poppies around the Tower of London, one for each British soldier killed. It is an appalling number. But it is a monument to our dead, the British dead. If it were turned into a monument for the bigger us, all the Allies, the number of poppies would increase to 6 million. And if it were truly a monument to the horrors of war for all the dead soldiers, friend and foe, then the total would amount to something like 10 million. And if all the civilians were counted in as well, it would amount to 17 million. It is true that a memorial of this kind is a way of remembering those who died for us, but it is a memorial to our injury, our hurt, our wound. Absent is any recognition of the injuries and hurts we have inflicted on them in the horror called the First World War. In discussions on genocide, the country that seems to spring most readily to most people's minds is Germany and its Nazi project of trying to annihilate an entire people. But ironically, Germany stands out in the international community as a nation that has created a number of monuments not to its triumphs but to its shame. This might, of course, have a lot to do with the fact that Germany was defeated in the war. Victors tend to erect monuments to their triumphs and their wounds. No doubt, if the Nazis had won, there would be no Holocaust museum in Berlin. It seems to me that it takes moral courage for victors to erect monuments to shame, and mostly this courage is found wanting. So, the kinds of monument that get erected by a nation give us some kind of indication as to what the attitudes of its leaders are towards its actions and history, and mostly humility is a quality that is hard to find. So I'm at the end of my paper, and I don't have any conclusions as such. I don't have a way of neatly tying up things. I have no prescription or formula of how to do forgiveness or how to do a training in remorse. So all I can do is gather up some of the topics and themes that this talk has traversed. So I've cautioned against racialized ideations in which we are all the same and good and they are all the same and bad. I have also cautioned against a version of moral equivalence that confuses objectivity with neutrality. The cynical use of power by the elites to silence and terrorize its citizens makes it more likely that we will become paralyzed citizens rather than reflective citizens. Attachments, identification and identity play a key role in how we interact with each other. Nevertheless, I have also cautioned against becoming hypnotized by the siren song of sentimental nationalism, fed by bewitching songs of triumph and long-lost glorious days. Most importantly, I have indicated that the work of forgiveness is not the work of a solitary individual, but the property of the network in which the bystander, us, has a crucial role to play. Saints are rare, sinners plenty, but mostly we are mortals. Hopefully, I have spoken in ways that opens out these matters so that we may discuss them further with each other, rather than me telling you what to think and why you should think it. I have spoken about my difficulties, inadequacies and struggles rather than you. My hope is that through resonance and association you might find yourself in some of what I have said, and so we might speak further together. Thank you.